whole new global talk show, Newstellers. Let's meet our panelists.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me say how gratifying it is to see this event take place, for in our pursuit of a 21st century paradigm for rural development, we are drawing inspiration from Korea's Saemaul Undong.
The new rural development paradigm is driven by Korea's Saemaul Movement, otherwise known as the New Village Movement, that was the cornerstone of the country's rapid economic development. Sharing the successful experience of the Saemaul Movement with developing nations, Korea's effort to help nations attain the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is garnering global attention. So President Park highlighted the significance of the Saemaul Movement at her speech at the 70th session of the UN General Assembly. And the new rural development paradigm was inspired by Korea's Saemaul Movement. But what was the foreign global media's view on this movement?
Well, actually, several foreign media have covered how fast was the development of Korea in the last decades. And in that sense, most of them mentioned the Saemaul movement as one of the factors that made possible that growth of Korea in the last decades.
Well, I was reading this very interesting article by The Economist. It was about all this huge effort by the current government to promote this model, this Saemaul movement model, to other countries. And the article was saying that the Saemaul movement did boost significantly the standard of living in Korean countryside. But on the other way, he was wondering whether this model could have some impact in other countries.
Right.
Sure, South Korea's rags to riches story has been well covered in international media. I mean, it's a great story how Korea, one of the poorest countries in the world a generation or so ago, is now one of the world's wealthiest. And of course, rural development was a part of that, but we can't forget that before the Saemaul movement began in 1971, Korea had already began to industrialize. The chaebols, the big conglomerates, Hyundai and Samsung, had started going with government assistance. You also had the United States more or less subsidizing Korea's military. That allowed Park Geun-hye, the leader at the time, to focus more attention onto projects like rural development.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways, the Saemaul Undong was a response to Korea's economic growth. It was a way of working to even out the vast income disparities between urban and rural areas. It was people in the cities and people in sort of industrial hubs were having their incomes rise very rapidly. And in agricultural communities, incomes were rising much slower, if at all. So I think one interesting thing maybe from the foreign media's perspective is not only that this movement took place in Korea and that it's perhaps being adopted in some countries abroad, but also that the Korean government is interested and actively trying to export this thing and actively trying to promote this thing, as we saw with President Park speaking at the United Nations. That's another interesting aspect of it.
Okay, so some foreign media interest, but hopefully that will increase as we hopefully see the success of some of these programs in the future. So we're going to be discussing rural development assistance programs in the developing world with our panel today, Rural Development Going Global. So more advanced countries have been helping developing nations with aid and assistance in various fields for years. But these days, South Korea is said to be playing a significant role in rural development with its Saemaul Movement model, which we talked about. Let's take a look at this news story right now. The globalization of Korea's Saemaul Movement is changing rural communities of developing nations. Rwanda has adopted Korea's Saemaul Movement program to improve the poor conditions of its rural communities. With volunteers dispatched from Korea to provide training in advanced agricultural technology, Rwanda has started to see positive transformations, including cultivated land and increased household income. So it's been a few years now since Korea's Saemaul Movement model has been implemented across some of the developing nations across the world, and it looks like they're getting some positive reviews. But obviously, the Saemaul Movement kicked off in the 1970s in Korea, in both rural and urban areas in Korea. And presumably, these developing nations are hoping to replicate that success. But let's talk about the similarities and differences between Korea's original Saemaul Movement and the global version that's now being implemented across the world. What are your thoughts?
I think first we should describe a little bit what was the Saemaul movement.
Okay.
In the 70s, the authoritarian president at the time, Park Geun-hye, decided to distribute bags of cement to the 30,000 villages all across Korea. And the villages were somehow free to use these bags of cement the way they wanted. There wasn't, the purpose was to empower them so they can decide themselves how to develop. So the whole idea was to modernize infrastructure,
Right.
but by encouraging the participation of the villagers themselves. And as well, there was some policies to discourage gambling, drinking. There was an element of social control as well. And it turned out to be pretty successful. But there was a huge effort by the Korean government at the time because 10% of the national budget was spent in the Saemaul Undong.
A huge amount.
It was a huge amount. So,
Okay.
but today now, I mean, obviously, developing countries cannot reproduce exactly the same model like that. It was developed in the 70s for very peculiar circumstances.
Yeah, I think every country has its own reality, and that's clear. And the way that they are trying to implement the Saemaul Undong in other countries is just applying some features that can be implemented in those countries. For example, that idea of Saemaul Undong, of self-reliance, I think is really important. It's really important to teach the farmers that they have to decide what they need, and they have to make their own system that can keep sustainable. In that way, I think that can be the biggest apportation of Saemaul Undong to the developing countries.
So teaching the people how to fish rather than just giving them
Yes.
free fish.
I think developing countries all have some similarities. One of the real improvements in Korean society that was made in the 1970s was the empowerment of local women. The
Okay.
Asia Development Bank has credited the Saemaul movement, letting women gain more of a outspoken role in their communities. They were elected to sort of village chairmanships during the movement, and that was, unheard of. South Korea had been a very patriarchal Confucian society where men usually called all the shots, but that began to sort of balance the playing field between the genders. And of course, in other developing countries, women often have less power than men. So, I mean, if that aspect of the model is implemented abroad, I would think that's a good thing.
Okay.
Well, I'd say one key difference in implementing the Saemaul movement in South Korea and abroad is, I think in South Korea, because of it's a country where everyone speaks the same language and where everyone's of the same ethnicity, I think the state traditionally found it relatively easy to implement big national level programs and to have people buy in. If you're talking about a country like Rwanda that has different ethnic groups where there's some history of antagonism between them, that has different languages, has a very different geographical topography. It's
Indeed, yeah.
very mountainous. There's a lot of communities that are somewhat isolated. I think in countries like Rwanda, it might be a little bit more difficult to implement something like that on a national level. And just one other difference I would point to is that, as Fred mentioned, it was the Saemaul movement went ahead with something like 10% of the national budget. With the movement being implemented in other countries abroad, it's not a big state-led thing like that. So it's not likely to have quite the same kind of impact.
So it seems that there's quite a few lessons to be learned from Korea's Saemaul movement, but it was quite a unique case as well. So we'll have to definitely take government policies, the environment, and the culture even into account when we look at these development programs in developing nations. In an ideal world, we would expect that those who are in the greatest need of help to get aid when they need it. But in reality, that doesn't really happen. And there are times when we need to set priorities. So in the context of international development assistance for poor regions, what type of investments do you think should be prioritized? And which countries would you say need it the most?
I think we should be very careful, and there is many examples of aid implemented wrongly that actually make things worse. And I really recommend this amazing book named The Road to Hell by Michael Maran. He's a former humanitarian worker who explained in several African countries how like food aid by the United States and other donors were really like completely undermining the existing systems, undermining the effort of local farmers, and really completely disrupting the local economy. So I think all the international aid agencies should be very careful to be sure that they work, that the local community participates and that in this project, and that they listen to what the local community said. And this is a mistake, like still today in 2015, a lot of aid agencies do not do that.
I totally agree with Fred. And one of my favorite writers, Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski, reported extensively from Ethiopia throughout the 80s, and he wrote a brilliant book called The Emperor. And in that book, his argument is that in the case of Ethiopia and in the case of a lot of developing countries, the famine was not actually caused by scarcity. It's not that there wasn't enough food. It's that the tyrannical government used food as a weapon of war. And when there were parts of the country that were not loyal to the government would deny them food. So I think when we're discussing which countries warrant having aid and things like that, we need to look at countries that have strong governance and that countries that are not, intentionally disrupting the conveyance of food and that are actually in need. Because I mean, if you look at a lot of developing countries, they're rich in resources. They're rich, they have a lot of arable land. They have generally what it takes to feed their population. So when a country has famine, you need to look at possible other reasons why. And of course there are natural disasters and there are genuine reasons why there are sometimes food shortages, but I think aid needs to be dispensed to places that have a demonstrated record of using it responsibly.
Another area that is that they would need some aid in that rural development is Latin America. Okay. Latin America is growing, and almost all the countries are getting in that good pace of development. But still, some rural areas they suffer poverty, and still some rural areas need that final push to make the farmers to develop and to make the farmers to cultivate their land and make those areas more developed.
Definitely.
Following what Stephen and Fred said about environment and multinationals, I recently reported from the Philippines about a community that was devastated by a multinational mining company that after decades of mining on this one island, after the company pulled out in the 1990s, they left behind an environmental disaster that poisoned local waterways, farmland. Now you have cases of lead poisoning in some communities, and the local government says this Canadian mining firm was never held accountable. So I think this is a problem too. Companies from the rich world operating with almost no oversight in developing countries.
Okay, so sometimes these developed nations can do a bit more harm than good, but there are associations like the Fair Trade Association that aims to help these farmers get a fair price for their produce. And one of the other things I got was to really listen and take into account the culture of the locals as well. We've talked about Korea's rural development program, the Saemaul Movement, and some other examples of the ongoing official development assistance or ODA programs as well. We've got a short interview clip now about people who have come to Korea from developing countries to learn about the agricultural technologies here. So let's take a look.
I'm here to get better experiences, advances in science.
For the specific training on the chemistry part.
To get acquainted with some modern vegetable technologies.
Korean agriculture, I think it is equipped or it is technological. I have seen here a lot of technology, so I share my experience.
One big problem I see with the aid you get is the high level of corruption. The aid comes in forms of, for example, chunks of money, but a few people benefit from it.
It could be improved through touching untouched areas. There is shortage of clean water in rural areas, so some project could be good to the giving clean water for the people.
In our country, the production is there, but the post-harvest loss is very high. So it could have for South Korea to assist more in improvement these agro-processing sectors. Like once farmers produce so many products, but because of post-harvest handling laws, the waste is very high.
Okay, so some of their comments echoing some of our panel's comments from earlier. Any particular thoughts or comments on the interviewees there?
Yeah, and it's an example of sustainability. So for local communities, it can work. If it's applied correctly, those local communities, they can learn how to be sustainable. And with the knowledge of Saemaul Undong, they can try to do their own crops, to sell their own crops. In some countries of Africa, they could even sell the remainings of the crops. So I think it's going to be positive, and I hope in the future they can really apply that system and they can get that sustainability that finally is the aim that we all pursue.
I mean, I think what Korea is doing in the developing country is a positive alternative to perhaps what countries like China are doing in Africa, where China has embarked over the past decade in development in especially sub-Saharan countries. And there's been a lot of criticism that China is more or less taking from these countries and not really giving back. Now, of course, there has been some economic benefit, but perhaps this approach that South Korea is doing with globalizing the Saemaul movement could spark more grassroots initiatives and have more of a level, broader benefits to communities than what China is doing, perhaps.
Okay, well, let's hope these programs are able to teach some valuable lessons and that these people are able to take away these lessons and apply them effectively to their own countries, and it doesn't just become a PR exercise. But what kind of aid organizations are in your countries, and what kind of work do they do?
Well, in Canada, there's been what was called CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. Like, there used to be a bunch of Canadian think tanks that were involved in exchanges with countries overseas and in research and all kinds of other good things. But the government in Canada, like some other governments around the world nowadays, is kind of turning inward. Providing foreign aid and saying that you're going to allocate millions of dollars to countries that most of your citizens have never heard of is generally not like a political point scorer. It's generally not something that people want to hear about in election season. People are generally more interested in like the local issues in their communities. So I think nowadays a lot of governments are a little bit hot and cold on providing aid.
Well, that's what happens in Spain, actually. Spain is a country that made the biggest cut on aid from the developed countries. And it's simply because we have an economic crisis. We had an economic crisis since 2008. And we have a big problem of unemployment. A lot of people lost their jobs. If there are some people that having a bad situation in your own country, you cannot think about helping more the people from other countries. Still, we give like 0.15% to ODA, and it's much less than the 0.7% that the European Union recommends. But I understand we are in a time of crisis, and it's difficult to help other countries.
The United States overseas aid programs date back to the 1960s during the Kennedy administration. Of course, the Peace Corps is maybe one of the most prominent aid agencies, where you have a lot of young volunteers, often right out of university, going to developing countries and assisting with agricultural development, educational development. And you also have USAID. A lot of the work that USAID does benefits local communities. Often there are strings attached, and I think the United States has come under criticism for some of its projects with USAID. In terms of in Cuba, there was accusations that USAID was funding opposition broadcasts against the Castro regime. And of course, for better or worse, but however, the problem is when you have organizations like this that are on the surface doing beneficial work, they lose their credibility if they're seen as meddling too much with local politics.
Right.
And then, of course, I think we should mention Europe because Europe, like EU and the member states, EU member states are together the biggest ODA donor in the world. Like together they account for more than 50% of all the ODA given. And aid is really becoming for the EU a central component of their diplomacy and even their like international identity. And as Atta said, like now there is a crisis, so the budgets are being cut, and EU is trying to like improve not only the quantity but the quality of aid.
Right.
And there is a lot of effort that are being done to try to depoliticize aid, to try to make it more efficient, to focus on the impact.
Well, in that case, Germany gives 8% of their GDP, which is a kind of a generous quantity, not enough coming to a level of 0.7% recommended, but it's kind of a generous amount, and also they monitorize pretty well that the aid is well distributed. They don't just give the aid, they just go there and monitorize and make sure that local communities, they are not just receiving the aid, they are just developing their own means to be sustainable in the future.
Okay, so I think as a donator myself, sometimes it's difficult to see why you should give your hard-earned money when you're not really seeing the effects of it, you know, and you become desensitized to these starving children on TV. They're on TV pretty often. So I think it is difficult, as you say, for governments to convince their voters to give these huge amounts of money, but it is obviously a very, very important thing. So hopefully our governments can do a better job of distributing it effectively and also helping these developing nations to sort out their governance systems. So in an ideal world, every country would obviously be well off without any aid, but certainly it doesn't seem that simple. So what do you think is the future of foreign aid programs? Do we need any changes?
I mean, of course, it is important for them to get involved, but I think on the private level with philanthropies like, let's say, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in the United States, they, since 2006, it's given billions of dollars to fight poverty in developing countries. Earlier this year, Bill Gates, in his annual letter addressing poverty, said that now is a turning point, and he feels that in the next 15 years, we will see the greatest reduction in poverty across the globe that has ever been experienced. And that's in part due to advancements in technology. One of the organizations that receives Gates Foundation funding is a telecommunications operator in Kenya called Safaricom. And what they've done with mobile banking has revolutionized money transfers in Kenya. It's made getting paid easier, it's safer, it's sprung up other startups around the industry. So Gates Foundation and other philanthropies like that that are not so tied to political agendas could perhaps do the most to alleviate problems of poverty.
Yeah, and there is a huge hypocrisy because we, like, as a developing country, we give aid a very tiny percentage of our GDP. But on the other side, we have policy of subsidizing our own agriculture that are hurting a lot farmers in developing countries.
Right.
For example, US, EU farmers are heavily subsidized, which make their product much cheaper than what they should be, which hurts the farmers in developing countries. There is a huge problem of policy coherence here. And I think that's one of the aspects that should be solved as soon as possible.
So it's not just a simple matter of what can we do to improve foreign aid programs. A lot of other things take into account. But a lot of effort and support is going into the developing world and these programs to fight the ongoing poverty. And I think it's important to look back, see what we've actually done to make a difference, how much has improved, and of course what we can do to continue that improvement in the future. Well, shall we wrap up with our final headlines? Is anyone ready to go first?
Finding local solutions to global problems.
Okay.
Okay. I would say rural development, the base of sustainable growth.
I would say all development starts with good governance.
Okay.
I would say something similar to what you said. The main teaching of the Saemaul movement was concentrate on your home-ground solutions.
Fantastic. Summarizing comments of another fascinating topic today. Thank you for your insight, as usual, my lovely panel. We will see you next week, and join us next week, viewers, for a whole new global talk show, Newstellers. We will be open for any opinions or requests on our official website, as well as our Facebook page.
I think Botswana underscores the importance of good government that managed to avoid a lot of the pitfalls.
The major problems stopping economic growth there in Nigeria is conflict. Right now we have Boko Haram.
Vietnam, one of the poorest countries 25 years ago, and they managed by modernizing their agriculture, by introducing new seeds.
We have the example of India, the state of Karnataka. Farmers got big debts. In only 1 month, more than 70 farmers suicide.